Today's episode is sponsored by Dashlane. Get a 30-day free trial and after that get a 10% discount using our code GEOGRAPHICS at dashlane.com/geographics. And let's get into it. It was one of the most secret places in the world. Vozrozhednya Island in the Aralsk Sea spent decades hidden behind a cloak of Soviet denials about its very existence. It appeared on no official maps, was never referred to by name, and was closed off to all but a handful of scientists. To those in the know, though, it was a place of nightmares. An island that may have looked idyllic from afar, but up close held a deadly secret. What that secret was, well, you can probably guess from its nickname, Anthrax Island. For 4 decades during the Cold War, Anthrax Island lay at the heart of Soviet bioweapons testing. Out on the wind-blasted steppe, animals would be tied up by the hundreds and exposed to weaponized smallpox, genetically engineered plague, or virulent strains of anthrax. While those on the shores lived in blissful ignorance, scientists created microbes capable of destroying all life on Earth multiple times over. In today's Geographics, we're journeying to one of the Soviet Union's most dangerous ruins and lifting the lid on its deadliest secrets. If you travel out the remote border between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, you'll encounter a vast desert filled with the rotting hulks of abandoned ships. This desert is all that remains of the Aralsk Sea, an inland sea that once was the size of Ireland, but now is an ecological disaster zone thanks to decades of Soviet mismanagement. But for all the dead Aralsk Sea may appear to be the USSR's worst legacy in Central Asia, there's an argument that the dubious honor should go to one of the former sea's former islands. Now almost completely cut off from the remaining waters, Vozrozhednya Island today looks no less grim than the rest of the Aralsk Sea. But deep within its soil, an invisible enemy still lurks, one potentially powerful enough to kill untold numbers. It's on this island that the last spores of Soviet anthrax may still remain. First discovered in the 19th century, the Vozrozhednya of the 1920s was almost the polar opposite of the wasteland that exists today. Surrounded by azure waters and populated by idyllic fishing villages, it was pretty much an easy shorthand for paradise. Vozrozhednya translates as Rebirth Island, which sounds exactly like the sort of hippie hangout the Beatles might have dropped acid on. But for the newly installed Soviet regime, quaint fishing villages, unspalt beaches, and chilled names weren't the primary thing they were looking for in an island. No, rather they were looking for somewhere remote, somewhere hot, somewhere they could conduct secret tests without being noticed. On the 200-square-kilometer island, they found it. Beginning in the 1930s, the Soviets started removing all of the fishermen from their quaint villages and replacing them with not-so-quaint scientists. By 1948, they'd even built a little laboratory to experiment on germs. But it wasn't until 1954 that the island really found its true awful purpose. That year, Moscow decided to massively expand the little laboratory, turning it into a thriving research center named Aralsk 7. This new scientific base would have only one goal: to create the deadliest bioweapons that the planet had ever seen. As the new facilities grew, hundreds and hundreds of scientists were brought there until the island was home to some 1,500 people. By all accounts, it was a good life. The specially built town of Kentubek had stadiums, schools, cinemas, and shops that were stocked with items that you couldn't get elsewhere in the USSR. After work, everyone on the island would congregate on the beaches, enjoying the Aralsk Sea's blue waters and the burning sun. It makes a bit of an odd contrast, doesn't it, seeing these smiling, happy people playing in the sea, knowing they're the same ones who just hours earlier were spraying smallpox, Q fever, and plague across the island's testing range. But then again, human history is full of warnings for those who would mess around with dark forces. Those smiling, happy people couldn't have known it, but their work would soon destroy their island's paradise. While life thrived in the city of Kentubek, just 15 kilometers south, things were looking a lot less rosy for anything with a pulse. It was here that Aralsk 7's testing grounds were based, up on a vast desert plateau. The location was chosen because the extreme heat, over 60 degrees Celsius in the sand, would kill most microbes. There were also few wild animals that could carry a virus to the mainland. Domestic animals, on the other hand, were there by the bucket load. The thing with bioweapons is that you do kind of have to test them on living creatures to make sure that they actually work. At Aralsk 7, this meant the usual array of rabbits, pigs, and donkeys being exposed to the germs, but it also meant the Soviets experimenting on the animals closest to humans. According to former lead researcher Gennady Lepkoshkin, Aralsk 7 conducted experiments that killed anywhere between 200 and 300 monkeys per year. Life for the poor creatures, it must have been a whole lot of confusing. Arriving at the lab, they would be fed on fresh fruit, bananas, oranges, and other gastronomic luxuries that the Soviet scientists experimenting on them couldn't dream of affording. Then, just when the monkeys were used to their new lives of unparalleled luxury, they would be taken out to the steppe, locked in tiny metal cages, and exposed to the nastiest diseases that nature had to offer. A couple of weeks later, these same monkeys would be corpses in a lab, chopped up by scientists intent on seeing what their bioweapons could do. And what those bioweapons were capable of is the sort of thing that would give your immune system nightmares. Using the latest advances in genetic engineering, the team at Aralsk 7 created a form of bubonic plague that couldn't be detected by conventional tests, a strain of tularemia that could resist almost any drug. They even designed a type of Legionnaire's disease that wouldn't show any symptoms until it was far too late. One source we read described this as the biowarfare equivalent of a silenced pistol. But the worst of all was anthrax. Although actual anthrax production was farmed out to other Soviet labs, such as the infamous Compound 19, it was here in Aralsk 7 that some of the freakiest breakthroughs were made. It was here that antibiotic-resistant anthrax was cultivated, here that scientists crossed anthrax with Bacillus cereus to create a disease that could rot your flesh as it killed you. They even managed to reduce the spores to a size of 5 micrometers. Normally, anthrax spores are too large for effective inhalation. They get trapped in human nostrils, but, well, not the Aralsk 7 version. A whiff of that, it would be guaranteed to reach your lungs. And once anthrax reaches your lungs, well, there's a 90% chance that you're going to die. We should mention here that the Soviets, they weren't the only ones trying to create nightmares in petri dishes. The US and the UK both enthusiastically experimented with anthrax until it had gotten so cost-effective that they could kill everyone in a 1-kilometer radius for $1 a pop. Because of this, America, Britain, and the USSR finally came together in April of 1972 to sign a joint treaty banning bioweapons. But while the US and the UK would abide by that agreement, the Soviets wouldn't even pause. You see, it was in the 1970s that Aralsk 7 became ground zero for some of the creepiest incidents in military history. It was a hot day in 1971 when scientists aboard the research vessel Lev Berg realized that something strange was up. The vessel was conducting research in the Aralsk Sea and had drifted within 15 kilometers of the Anthrax Islands. Now a weird brown haze was coming towards them across the water, settling over their boat. Since it had no smell, no nasty taste, the researchers just shrugged it off. One of the scientists on board even went out in the haze to conduct tests. The sailors on board the ship had no way to know it, but their boat had just been engulfed by a cloud of weaponized smallpox. Now, of all the diseases you really don't want to come down with, smallpox should be very high on the list. It's not only that it causes intense vomiting, fever, and awful pain, it's not only that it kills 30% of those that it infects after covering their bodies with pus-filled sores, it's that those who survive then have to deal with possible blindness and carrying dreadful scars for the rest of their lives. Not long after going out into that brown haze, the female researcher on the Lev Berg returned to her home city. There, she fell ill with smallpox. Before the Soviet authorities could set up a quarantine, she had infected 9 more people. Of the 10 cases, 3 would die, including her younger brother. But what was the weirdest part of all this? Well, that unnamed woman had already been vaccinated for smallpox. But that's the sort of place that Vozrozhednya Island was. It was a place where unexplained things happened. Starting in 1970, for example, local fishermen began dragging whole nets full of dead fish from the sea around the island. In 1972, one of these fishermen's boats was found drifting in the Aral Sea, seemingly abandoned. When locals went on board to investigate, they found the ship's 2 owners, both dead from the bubonic plague. Then there was the incident in May of 1988. In a single hour, a herd of antelope on a nearby steppe all succumbed to a mysterious illness. 50,000 died in under 60 minutes, and to this day, no one knows why. But as creepy as these legends are, the most terrifying tale from the Soviet bioweapons program would actually happen several hundred kilometers away. So remember how we mentioned the infamous Compound 19? Well, that compound was where Soviet scientists took the advances made at Aralsk 7 and used them to brew gigantic vats of anthrax. Unlike Aralsk 7 though, Compound 19 was located near a major population center, the city of Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg. In early April 1979, an air filter at Compound 19 broke down and wasn't replaced. By the time anyone had noticed, a cloud of anthrax had leaked into the wild. That day, the winds were blowing towards the city. Spores of anthrax drifted over the countryside, settled on the city's outskirts. In the weeks that followed, scores of civilians came down with anthrax. While exact numbers are hard to come by, it's estimated that between 68 and 105 people died. While the Soviets officially blamed infected meat sold on the black market, party bosses were all too aware of how close of a call it had been. Had the winds been blowing slightly harder that day, the spores would have been blown right into the city center. Thousands upon thousands could have died in what would have been the bioweapons equivalent of Chernobyl. In the aftermath of actual Chernobyl, the party seemed to recognize this. Compound 19 was quietly closed down in 1988, and all of its anthrax stocks were sent to the safest and remotest location of the USSR. And that's how 200 tons of weaponized anthrax wound up being dumped on Vozrozhydenia Island. Now, you might not need to protect yourself from the dangers of anthrax, but you do need to secure your identity, and the absolute best way to do that is with Dashlane, and I want to tell you about them before we get into the rest of today's video. Dashlane is a one-stop shop for all of your digital identity protection needs. If your passwords are all the same, bad idea by the way, you can use Dashlane's password manager to create and securely store complex and unique passwords, making it less likely that your accounts are going to get compromised. They also have a VPN as part of their service, meaning you can browse the internet securely and confidently, even on public Wi-Fi. But not just that, they also actively monitor the dark web to see if your information has been leaked somewhere. That means that you can go and change your passwords before someone breaks into your other accounts that share that same password. Plus, Dashlane does what it's always done. It stores your passwords, it keeps your personal data secure, it fills all of those annoying boxes for payment info or passwords for you. A lot of Dashlane is for free, but there are some premium upgrades you can buy if you want more from the service. To see if those are right for you, you can take a 30-day free trial and after that get a 10% discount using our code GEOGRAPHICS at dashlane.com/geographics. That's also a great way to support the show, and it keeps us making these videos. So go protect yourself, link below, and let's get back to today's video. Now, here's something you need to know about anthrax. It's really hard to kill. While smallpox will die out in the wild, anthrax spores are basically the Incredible Hulk of the disease world, surviving anything that nature throws at them. To give you an idea of just how unkillable anthrax is, the BBC reported that excavations at a Scottish hospital from medieval times found spores still living in the ruins. So if you're going to dump 200 tons of anthrax onto a random island, you better make sure you do a good job of properly disposing of it. But this is the Soviet Union we're talking about, where corner cutting and arse covering was all part of the culture. Rather than be destroyed, the anthrax was simply poured into pits and buried. This wasn't too big of a deal, as long as the USSR was still around to stop random idiots from wandering onto the islands. But if the Soviet Union did something crazy, like totally collapse, it would become kind of a huge deal. Want to guess what happened next? Well, a scant 3 years after dumping all that anthrax on the islands, the USSR, it imploded. In a single day, all of the scientists on Aralsk 7 were evacuated and the research labs were set on fire. By the time the smoke cleared, the ruins of Aralsk 7 no longer lay in the USSR, but divided between the newly independent states of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And that meant trusting two brand new chaotic nations to keep a lid on the world's largest stockpile of anthrax. In its decades of testing, Aralsk 7 had dumped weaponized bubonic plague across the island. While the test sites had been sprayed with poison, first to stop any animals carrying the disease to the mainland, Soviet authorities assumed some small mammals would have survived and been exposed to the plague. Of those, a fraction would have survived the plague and passed it on to fleas living in their fur. These fleas would have been capable of handing it down across generations, leaving the possibility that a highly engineered plague might still be present on the island. This became an even bigger problem when, at the end of the 1990s, the island surrendered its island status. The slow death of the Aral Sea had turned it into a peninsula connected to the mainland by a narrow land bridge. That meant that any idiot could wander into the abandoned base, kick up some anthrax-laden sand, and return to civilization carrying a bacteria designed to spread as quickly as possible and kill a ton of people. It's a pretty scary idea, but what's even scarier is that no one really knew what to do about it. It would take a world-changing event to finally decontaminate Anthrax Island for good. If you didn't live through it, it's hard to accurately describe the sheer, numbing anxiety of autumn 2001. First, there were the 9/11 attacks, which killed nearly 3,000 Americans and left downtown New York and the Pentagon in ruins. But it was what came second that really changed how the world thought about Vozrosadinya Island. On October 2nd, 62-year-old photojournalist Bob Stevens was hospitalized in Florida. At first, he was suspected of having meningitis, but the reality quickly turned out to be a lot more terrifying. On the 4th of October, Stevens was diagnosed with suffering from anthrax. In the wake of the diagnosis, more people connected to the media began coming down with the disease. By late October, it was clear that a bioterrorist was at large in America. Anthrax-laden letters were being dispatched to mailing rooms around the country. Coming so soon after 9/11, it looked as if everyone's worst fears had been realized. Al-Qaeda now had access to biological WMDs. Ultimately, this fear would turn out to be unfounded. Today, the 2001 anthrax attacks are not attributed to radical Islamists, but to Bruce E. Ivings, a US government researcher who was meant to be working on an anthrax vaccine. But in late 2001, with 17 people infected and 5 dead, attention wasn't on government workers with a grudge, but on places terrorists could easily get anthrax. The ruins at Aralsk 7, well, they were very top of the list. With the case of the deadly letters still unsolved, Washington dispatched a team of specialists to the Aral Sea. With the blessing of the Kazakh and Uzbek governments, the US team excavated the 200 tons of buried spores and mixed them with an extremely powerful powdered bleach. The entire process took 4 months, but by the end, the Soviet anthrax buried on the island had been neutralized. Anthrax Island was no longer a threat. Or was it? A few years after the US team left the island, British journalist Nick Middleton received rare permission to travel to the island to shoot a documentary. He and his team wore biohazard suits complete with air filters, but even those were not enough. Inside the ruined buildings of Aralsk 7, their filters completely backed up after a mere 15 minutes, something that usually only happens in the presence of very high concentrations of very bad stuff. They wound up evacuating the compounds, but not before making a terrifying discovery. There, in the buildings the Soviets had burnt down before they left, were several dozen test tubes and petri dishes that had survived the flames. Sealed, microscopic glass prisons containing God only knew what forgotten nightmares. The anthrax in the grounds may have been neutralized by the US team, but they'd ignored the former labs. Far from being safe, Aralsk 7 could still be as dangerous as ever. In 2017, an estimated 50,000 people joined a tour of the ruined reactor and ghost town at Chernobyl in the Ukraine. That's a lot of people, and it's only grown since then. At the time of this recording, Chernobyl is on its way to becoming Ukraine's top tourist site. All of this might explain what seems to be happening on the islands. Today, it's no longer an island or even a peninsula. With the Aral Sea effectively vanished, the island has become just another part of the surrounding desert. That makes accessing it easier than ever. It also means that there are those out there looking to capitalize on the growing notoriety of Anthrax Island. In August 2018, the Kazakh government officially declared the island safe to visit. In early 2019, it was reported that the Uzbek government was actively considering ways to turn it into a tourist site. It's easy to see why the respective governments might be tempted to take this route. Like Ukraine, they suffered terribly under the Soviets, unwitting pawns in a system that abused their citizens and led to disaster. But while Ukraine is at least now making money out of Chernobyl, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan remain largely ignored by Western tourism, especially the area around the Aral Sea. And the remains of the island, well, they've got a lot in common with Chernobyl. The ghost town of Kantebek appears like a desert version of Pripyat, a collection of ruined, time-trapped buildings being reclaimed by nature, while yellowed posters of Lenin look sternly on. The invisible nature of the disaster gives everything a similar silent air too. Just as radiation is something you can't see or feel, so too anthrax spores lurk below the level of human visibility. But there may also be a big difference. Chernobyl has been subjected to one of the most rigorous cleanup processes in human history. The radiation pockets have been mapped, and those in the zone know precisely where they are. The same it can't be said of Anthrax Island. In the 1940s, the British government tested anthrax on an island of its own, a strip of land off the coast of Scotland named Grignard. Just a single year of testing made the island so dangerous that it was closed off to everyone for 50 years. When it was finally decontaminated in the 1980s, it required the removal of the entire layer of topsoil and the soaking of the ground under 280 tons of formaldehyde. Cleanup took 4 years, and it was only because Grignard was so small that it was ever declared safe. Now compare Vozrozhedenia with its mere 4 months of cleanup and its vast size, where removing an entire layer of topsoil is simply impossible. Think too of all the times that anthrax was tested here, how all it would take is for a small handful of spores to survive buried deep in the sand to potentially trigger a future outbreak. Speaking to the BBC in 2017, Les Bailey, an international expert on anthrax and former researcher at the UK's bioweapons facility Porton Down, he made it very clear how safe the island is likely to be. "Oh, there will still be anthrax there, no problem," he was reported as saying. "If the area floods, the spores can float back up and earthworms in the soil can move it around." Aralsk 7 may be considered a future tourist site, but the reality is that it's still a potentially dangerous place. Anthrax spores, nearly a century old, have been known to infect and kill people, or even cause outbreaks. When it comes to the invisible chimeras engineered on Rebirth Island, who knows how long they could last? The decades of Soviet scientists engineering ever deadlier viruses and bacteria may be over, but their legacy, it still lives on. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below, and don't forget to subscribe. When you're subscribing, hit that notification bell so you find out when we put out a new video. Also, why not check out another channel I do called Top 10s? It's sort of top 10 format videos. If you like this, I think you'll also enjoy that channel that I present. It is linked to below. And as always, thank you for watching.